Good morning. Today, my group and I will talk about the goods market in an open economy.
We'll first talk about the IS relation. It is when there is equilibrium in the goods market, and this happens
When production equals the demand for goods.
in a closed economy. All output is sold domestically, and expenditure is divided into three components: consumption, investment, and government purchases. In an open economy, the demand for domestic goods now have import and export factors. Therefore, the equation is the same as before, but now adding two new variables. Together, they form net exports, which are exports minus imports. Now, domestic demand is represented by this equation. Consumption depends positively on disposable income. Investment increases with production, but decreases as real interest rate increases. Government purchases are autonomous, and net exports depend on real exchange rates. Therefore, imports are positively related to domestic income and real exchange rates, while exports are positively related to foreign output but negatively related to real exchange rates. Now, let's take as an example the USA. A rise in foreign income, other things remaining equal, will increase our exports and improve our trade balance. As a result, aggregate demand will increase in our country, with a favorable effect on our national income, output, and employment.
Demand for domestic goods is equal to those variables which are consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Equilibrium will be reached when domestic output Y equals demand for domestic goods Z. Therefore, equilibrium condition is given by this formula. The variables are consumption, which depends on output and taxes, investment, which also depends on output and type of interest, plus government spending, which Spain is an example of a country that spend on administration above the EU average, or minus net export that is subject to the real exchange rate. So this graph shows us the demand for domestic goods Z, given by the ZZ line. The condition Y equal Z is represented by the 45-degree line, where the equilibrium output is determined by point A. In this point, domestic output is equal to demand for domestic goods. So the second graph shows us that the NX line, net exports, are a decreasing function of output. This tells us that there is a trade deficit, which means there is more imports than exports. So in order to have the desired trade surplus, or at least trade balance, output level should be below or equal Y TV point, having more exports than imports on the same for both.
Terms, when there is an increase in the domestic demand, the domestic output increases, but the trade balance worsens, meaning that usually there is a trade deficit. Wanted to plot an increase in the domestic demand, it would look something like this. So the domestic demand curve is denoted by the ZZ line, which is at equilibrium at point A, where output equals Y, and there is a trade balance where net exports equals 0. So imagine that the economy is going through a recession period, and that the government decides to increase its government spending in order to recover from this period. The outcome would be that as we have increased one of the components of the domestic demand increases and it shifts upwards to the line ZZ, there is an increase in output from Y to Y, and the effects on trade is that there is a trade deficit that goes from B to C. Difference with a closed economy are mainly two. The first one is that in a closed economy, the trade effect is not taken into account, whereas in an open economy, we see that an increase in domestic demand leads to a trade deficit. But as the slope of domestic demand curves in open economies are smaller than in closed economies, the multiplier effect is smaller, and therefore the effect of government spending on output is smaller. In regards to foreign demand, when there is an increase in the foreign demand, there is also an increase in domestic output, but nevertheless, there is an improvement in the trade balance. Consider now that an increase in foreign output, which leads to an increase in Y in the graph, could be due to an increase in foreign government spending. So the initial demand for domestic goods is given by the line ZZ. The equilibrium is once again at point A with output level Y, and we're also going to assume that trade is balanced. DD is the domestic demand for goods. Note that DD is steeper than ZZ. So higher foreign output means higher foreign demand, including higher foreign demand for domestic goods. So the effect of the increase in foreign output is an increase in domestic exports by the change, as we can see in the graph, in X. Thus, the demand for domestic goods shifts to ZZ, the net exports function also shifts to net X, The new equilibrium is at point A, with output level Y, Higher foreign output leads to higher exports of domestic goods, which increases domestic output and the domestic demand for goods through the multiplier. As we can see, the DD function does not shift. At the new equilibrium, the function DD is below ZZ, Thus, while imports increase, the increase does not offset the increase in exports, and the trade balance improves. There is a trade surplus.
Now, we are going to continue with the impact that depreciation has on the trade balance and the level of output. If we take the definition of net exports and we introduce the concept that my colleague Alba previously explained about the relation that could be established between the real exchange rates, imports, and exports, we came up with this new formula. As you can appreciate, in this formula, the real exchange rate appears in 3 different times, which means that in a case of real depreciation, the trade balance will be affected through 3 different channels. The first one is that exports will increase. The fact that now, due to the real depreciation, the national goods are relatively less expensive abroad will be translated into an increase of the foreign demand. Secondly, imports will decrease. The real depreciation makes foreign goods relatively more expensive. So this will be translated into a shift of the national demand towards domestic goods. And finally, the real price of foreign goods in terms of domestic goods will increase. This will increase the import bill, as now, due to the depreciation, the same level of foreign goods will be more expensive. Therefore, for the trade balance to improve following a depreciation, exports must increase enough and imports must decrease enough in order to compensate for the increase in the price of imports. This condition under which, during a period of real depreciation, a country experiences an increase in the net exports is called the Marshall-Lerner condition. This depreciation leads to a shift in both foreign and domestic demand towards domestic goods. And also this shift leads to an increase in the domestic output and to an improvement in the trade balance. Nevertheless, we have to keep in mind that depreciation works by making foreign goods more expensive, and therefore national with the same amount of money have access to a less amount of goods in foreign countries, which could represent a decline in the living standards and to social unrest.
Hello, now we are going to explain the last part of the chapter that is called saving, investment, and the current account balance. So until now we have seen how to rewrite the condition for equilibrium in the goods market as the condition that investment is equal to savings. So now we are going to derive the corresponding condition for the open economy. So here we have the first equation that we are going to use. And now we are going to do 3 steps. The first step, we are going to move consumption to the left side, and we are going to subtract taxes in both sides. And also we are going to denote net exports by NX in capital letters. After doing this, we have this equation, and now we have to pass to the second step. So now we are going to do the second step. That is very easy. As we are dealing with an open economy, we can state that the income of domestic residents is equal to the output plus the net income from abroad plus the net transfers received. So as you can see in this equation, NI is equal to the net income from abroad and NT is equal to the net transfers received. Okay, so after these 2 steps, we can develop some conclusions and get to the final equation. So on the left side of the equation, we have a parenthesis. That part of the equation we are going to call it disposable income. Also, we have to know that the disposable income minus the consumption is equal to the savings, and we are going to use an S in capital letters. On the right side, we have NX plus NY plus NT. This is equal to the current account, and we are going to name it as CA in capital letters. So taking into consideration these conclusions, we have these final equations. Okay, so we have that the current account balance is equal to the savings, that the savings is equal to the sum of private savings and public savings minus the investment. So considering this equation, we can reach to two conclusions. Okay, so the first conclusion is that if we have a current account surplus, it means that a country is saving more than it invests. On the other hand, if we have a current account deficit, it means that the country have less savings than investments. So with all these concepts that we have seen, we can explain a lot of interesting things in the real world. For instance, imagine a country that has more investments than savings. So the country must be borrowing from the rest of the world. Therefore, we can affirm one thing. There is a country in the rest of the world that lends to the rest of the countries and saves more than it invests.
So to sum up, what have we seen? Well, first, that the demand for domestic goods in an open economy is equal to the domestic demand for goods, so consumption plus investment plus government spending minus imports and plus exports. Second, that in an open economy, if the foreign demand or exports increase, then domestic output increases too, and the trade balance will improve. While if the domestic demand increases, trade balance will worsen. Third, in comparison to closed economies, we know that in open economies, increases in domestic demand will increase output less than if we were in a closed economy. Why? Because in open economies, part of this aggregate demand will count as part of the imports. Fourth, the Marshall Learning condition establishes that real depreciation will first deteriorate trade balance and then improve net exports. And this is a process which is called the J-curve. 5. Finally, we have learned which are the conditions for reaching the equilibrium in an open economy. And they are that savings, both private and public, minus investment must be equals to the current account balance. So what does a surplus mean? Well, that savings are greater than investment, and on the contrary, deficits imply that investments are greater than savings. So from an economic point of view, what do you think? Is it more favorable to be in an open or in a closed economy? Please share your answers with us in the forum.